a lot of companies under an incredible pressure to produce more creative assets with the same budget, with the same number of people. They want to have their digital assets in multiple different languages, in multiple different sizes, for multiple different segments. And suddenly, when you have AI and you combine it with automation, you're able to unlock 70, 80, 90% efficiency gains, because suddenly we're taking away a lot of the manual, cumbersome labor, and we help them automate that.
How are the world's largest brands leveraging AI? Where are they getting the greatest ROI? What are the biggest fears and barriers to adopting AI at scale? To answer these questions, we invited one of the world's leading generative AI consultants to explain what's happening today and shifts he expects in the near future.
If I'm able to 10x content, I can be much more specific, much more tailored to my different segments. And that's one thing that really enables, right? So being able to target my consumer much more specifically. I think there's one part that's changing. The other part that is changing is actually to enable that. There's a different approach to your brand, to your design system.
This is episode 27, and our guest is Jan Emmanuele, Director of Generative AI Consulting at Superside. We're discussing implementing AI at scale in creative teams, and we cover where businesses are getting the most value from AI, GenAI's ability to massively scale creative outputs, processes and strategies for implementing AI effectively, addressing the challenges and fears of leveraging AI, and how AI's adoption as a creative multiplier will surge in 2026. This episode is perfect for business, product, and design leaders who want to get details on how to best implement AI to augment and automate workflows.
There's sometimes a lack of understanding of what's possible if you combine technology with the data that you're having in your marketing team, with all the different segments, with the creative assets that you can generate. So I think there's a lot about closing that loop by including multidisciplinary teams that have the right capabilities across all of these segments.
Jan leads Superside's AI consulting department, working intimately with some of the leading companies, including several Fortune 500 companies, to integrate AI into their creative workflows. Prior to that, he was leading investments into AI startups at a venture capital fund and has 3 years' experience as a McKinsey consultant working on tech and software topics. He also holds a PhD on AI for cancer treatment and developed AI solutions in a medical device company, including several patents. Thank you for listening to the Design of AI podcast. We provide a pragmatic and practical deep dive into what AI can do and how it's transforming industries. We help designers, researchers, and product managers excel in a rapidly changing future. If you find this strategic content helpful, make sure to follow us on your favorite podcasting app. It really helps us if you leave reviews. This episode was hosted by Arpi Drag-Figueredo, the founder and head of product strategy for PH1 Research, and Brittany Hobbs, VP Insights at Huge. Please make sure to subscribe to our Substack to never miss an episode. On the Design of AI Substack, you'll also receive more strategic insights and recommended products. We'll also be announcing events soon too at designofai.substack.com.
Hi, Jan. We've spoken with so many amazing guests over the last couple of weeks and months about the potential of AI to transform design and product. They've laid out so many distinct visions, strategies, ideas, so many different ways that AI and the technology will simplify, speed up, and augment capabilities. But today, I'm really excited to speak with you to understand how these organizations can prepare and process the idea of getting AI into their workflows, how they can leverage it successfully. But before we really go into that, I'd like to learn a bit about how you found yourself working in AI, because I know there's a bit of an interesting story there.
Happy to, and thank you so much for having me here. The story of how I got into AI really started roughly 10 years ago, when I started working on medical devices. And the truth already back then was that predictive AI has become a big part of how software companies are tackling some of the issues like cancer treatment. So I started working on these image processing technologies that mostly use deep neural networks. And interestingly, now that we found ourselves nearly a decade later, these technologies nowadays are used also for image generation, such as in Midjourney and the likes. So coming from that more technological angle, and nowadays working with creators very deeply on these topics.
But you also pursued AI in your academic career, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I did do my part of my master on AI, on data science. And then I did my PhD on AI for cancer treatments. Got very deep into the technicalities and actually published different patterns on how to use AI for cancer treatment and so on. So very deep technologically. And then nowadays, given that I worked with McKinsey, for instance, on different organizational problems, nowadays really focusing both on the technological side, so understanding how AI can help, but then also very much nowadays looking into what's the organizational challenge in integrating AI into workflows. Because at the end of the day, what we're starting to see is that your tech side is maybe 20% of the problem, but the majority of the problems really lie within your organizational challenges, from change management, identifying the right workflows, prioritizing the right workflows, and bringing all of your organization along, which is probably the bigger challenge than this tech by itself.
Now, since you have been working in AI for a long time, you must have seen a lot of change in the models and the quality of results. Still today, there are plenty of stories about how the models aren't very accurate yet. And there's plenty of data to show that business leaders are still reluctant. They're scared. They're not really integrating AI at the pace that the media might say they are. Where are you finding that businesses are getting the most value from integrating Gen AI today into their workflows?
What we're seeing is maturity curves across the different use cases of AI. So like I said a bit in the beginning, when we talk about predictive AI, which was about identifying patterns mostly, that really has matured between 2015 and 2020. Then from basically the release of ChatGPT onwards, we started seeing that rise in generative AI, which is about how can I generate new things that didn't exist before, rather than recognizing existing patterns. And the newest trend, which started taking shape from mid last year, is agentic AI. So how can I have AI that is autonomously acting? Now, even within generative AI, we start seeing these different use cases at different maturity places. So if we think about text generation, right, which was probably the first use case that came, that one is fairly mature. And once you start using it the right way, you integrate your data with it, you fine tune it on your tone of voice and the likes. We're actually seeing that many people nowadays are using AI in copywriting, especially in the creative realm, because once you do that fine tune, you're actually at a quite good quality level already. And with that, for instance, at Superside, a lot of our copywriters are leveraging AI for that topic specifically. Now that's one part. Then once we go to image generation, for instance, we're slightly lagging behind that maturity of text generation, roughly half a year. And what we're seeing there is for specific use cases, it's already very valuable. So for instance, illustration generation, also some parts of photorealistic image generation, people are starting to use that very aggressively, right? If you think back into the campaign that Mango did, for instance, last year, or Puma, who had their AI influencer running, arguably they've moved it back due to some concerns. But we're seeing that really start taking shape, for instance, in e-commerces that start to replace product photography. Now, when we look into things that are not yet there, that's mostly in terms of the video generation side, where it's still a bit nascent and we've yet to see people use that at scale. So those are a bit like the use case. Now, the interesting thing in there is that the value of these use cases comes when it's integrated into creative workflow. So naturally, even if quality, for instance, in image generation was premature roughly a year ago, we started seeing a lot of impact in using that technology in the concepting phase. So already generating ideas and bringing them to an 80% stage much faster. Similarly, that's now where we stand with video, where we can pre-produce some of the shots. And then naturally, once we go to the production phase, with a much better understanding. And that's one part where people get value out. Now, the truth is, if you ask me in terms of where are people right now getting their value out, that's a slightly different story. because the truth is that probably the media is a bit ahead of the reality of where companies are using AI, especially within creative. So most of the clients that I'm speaking to, they're still in their early stages of adopting AI. So majority of the companies, what they're doing right now is mostly in terms of using some Microsoft Copilot, some ChatGPT within productivity. So writing emails, understanding briefs and the likes, and partly within copywriting. Very few companies have already ventured out and started doing at scale image generation, at scale voiceovers and the likes.
Now, the obvious question here is, if we know there's an ROI at the other end of it, why do you believe these organizations are not taking more steps into the next generation?
No, 100%. I think there's multiple different challenges that come at the same time. The most obvious is that technology is still fairly new. So ChatGPT is like 2-3 years old, right? And with that has only matured to a quality level that's acceptable in many use cases, roughly a year and a half ago. So with that, naturally, as technology was early, it still takes time to then adopt it in an enterprise grade. If you just think about your procurement timelines in an enterprise that are typically somewhere around 6 to 18 months, there's a natural lag there. That's one challenge, right? Like just technology that came only fairly recently. The second challenge is everything that has to do with legal. Given that the regulatory environment is still very much in flux, naturally there have been now in the last month some clarifications on copyright, especially towards image generation. But still, it's not a place where all the decisions have been made, especially when it comes to copyright infringements of models trained on public data, and similarly copyrightability of assets generated with AI. And naturally, if you're in a large enterprise that is very much exposed to lawsuits and the likes, you typically take a conservative stance and you want to make sure that these legal uncertainties are resolved before you step further. That's one question. And arguably, we see a bit of change in there. And I think the third part is that naturally, for a large organization, your leadership team is typically the ones that need to drive a lot of that change. Now, as an executive leader, I have a lot of different topics on my plate at any given time. And it's really about when do I prioritize which topic in my organization. And with that, many organizations, if we think over the last 2 years, in 23, we're very skeptical if AI is really delivering any value. In 20, we saw that shift where we started to realize that there is sufficient value and people started tipping their toes into that. But only towards end of 24, we started seeing at scale that creative leaders are now under an urgency to integrate AI. And with that, in their budgeting process towards end of last year, started accounting for integrating AI into their teams. And with that, we see now only in 25, really that uptick in interest on integrating AI at scale. So we're moving from that piloting phase last year, like I said, right, like ChatGPT for copywriting, to like now we're starting to look into how can we do that more holistically in an organization.
So it sounds like, based on your internal evidence, that 2026 and 2027 should see a huge uptick in the significant at scale adoption of this technology. Is that what you're saying?
It's basically what I'm saying. So if we think about a typical innovation curve, like a typical S curve, what we're seeing was that last year was only the most tech forward companies that wants to take more risk who were going into that. And now this year we start seeing enterprises, like your regular enterprises, starting to adopt the technology or starting to think about adopting that. And with that, having their rollout plans. Arguably, I don't think we will be done by 26, 27. If we think back, for instance, to cloud transition that was happening early 2000s, 2005, 2006, right? At the end of the day, you saw a very long curve of that cloud transition from being an on-premise first company to being a cloud native company, which I agree was still happening until like 2015 with your laggards like financial institutions, like medical companies doing their transition towards cloud. And similarly, we're likely going to see that with AI, where we're now seeing first use cases, for instance, customer success, which is massively disrupted, especially for younger tech forward companies right now. From that one use case is going to follow that S curve over the next 3-4 years. And then everything else is going to follow exactly that same S curve, but might take arguably 3 to 5 years until we really at an 80% adoption across the wider enterprise segment.
So there's no doubt that the economics of this are going to start trending in a very positive, bullish direction. But this is a world full of creatives, and the tools and implementations you're dealing with are largely related to creatives. This might be designers, writers, advertisers, art directors. They believe when you say things like agents, and automation, and replacing, that this technology is invasive. It's trying to replace them for better or worse. And they like it when we describe GenAI as a workhorse, something that helps them get things done faster, not necessarily do better or more creative work. But what do you believe is the future of GenAI in the next couple of years as a creative force?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think the answer needs to be somewhat differentiated, because what we're seeing when we're speaking to many creative organizations is really two different types of creativity. There's your upstream, big idea, big concept, kind of like your unique truth, so to say, that is engaging your persona. In that part, arguably, is still very human. AI can help in that. AI can help in the concepting, can come up with ideas. But at the end, the unique truth, that's still uniquely human. And it's probably going to stay like that. The interesting part that we see is like once we go downstream from there, we're going to see kind of like a downward spiral in terms of cost at the end of the day, or hours spent per asset, which comes from traditional automation, right? Like many companies haven't yet taken that initial step in terms of rolling out their assets across different sizes, channels in a more automatic way. And I think that part of creativity, of design, which is more your production design, that one we're going to see more and more disrupted using AI, which is arguably a bit of a downward pressure, but that's also oftentimes the part that people are less attached to emotionally, just because that part of creativity is not really creativity at the end. That's more your factory production. And the value that we're going to see, even when AI is there, of a human, is really that big idea in how I bring that to life. Now, the interesting shift that we're going to see is like, what part or how far upstream is AI disrupting? And I think the interesting thing that I was discussing yesterday with one leader of a creative agency was that suddenly, because I have these tools, I'm able to communicate my ideas much better. Because suddenly I'm able to go to an 80% version of that idea very fast, which means that for a creative agency that naturally has to communicate that idea to their clients and their client counterparts to their senior leadership, naturally within there, suddenly it becomes possible to generate amazing ideas as a human, arguably with help of AI. And then being able to roll these out to 80% versions very rapidly, and being able to communicate these ideas that are intangible into tangible things.
Now, that example you brought up in terms of concepting about, first draft, about iterating very quickly, using as a bit of a coach, is something a lot of people have mentioned. Now, I'm hoping to understand, are there examples of the technology actually reaching a new level of creativity? One of our guests in the past hypothesized that the hallucination capabilities of GenAI could actually unleash a new form of divergent thinking in creative fields. Have you seen any examples where there's literal creative augmentation?
We're starting to see that. I think it's still very early. And I think a bit the part in there is that creatives still want to be seen as the originator of the idea and will always keep on that. The interesting thing about creativity to me, and arguably I'm not a creative by training, is that many times when you think about both art and music, we are always taking inspiration from past work. Like if you think about Picasso, who basically said, like, you need to understand the rules before you can break them. And I think that's a bit where AI will be very helpful, because suddenly it can comprehend a lot of different directions, ideas, styles, and help the creative to understand, okay, what are the different direction styles that exist as an inspiration, right? I would compare that nearly to how many artists would look into, I don't know, your Pinterest. That's the most easy example. But I think much more interestingly, right, many of our creatives, they take inspiration from the great artists of the world, right? Like they would go to a museum, look at a Monet, look at a Picasso, and get inspired by the work that former artists have done. Now, when we have AI, suddenly we're able to condense that knowledge and actually spring out these ideas, which at the end of the day, right, like this is just rebranding existing work, rebranding existing assets and ideas. And naturally, the humans still combining them and figuring out, like, hey, this is the thing that really sparks that interhuman connection, that interhuman creativity. But AI can be helpful in terms of that in the ideation phase.
Yeah, one of the things I find fascinating about this technology is not what it's capable of, but it's what it can change in our workflows. And I say this because I found that specifically the remote generation that we're in right now has forced many of us to work as individual contributors. And we actually don't bounce ideas off people the way we used to. We don't work in offices where you see other design options and crits happen at the same time. And we actually have the ability to expand our thinking. Now, there's ethics to be discussed, and there's tons and tons of questions there. But nonetheless, I'm excited to hear that some of your clients are exploring the future of this. Now, to get to a point where divergent thinking is actually a core feature of AI, how many years away do you think we are from that?
I think we're very close, if not we're already there. And I think a lot of that comes to a bit what you said, like how do I integrate AI into my workflows? How do I make that a tool to come up with new ideas? And I think technology-wise, we're very close. Like if you think about ChatGPT 3, you think about DeepSeek, right? Like the capabilities are very vast already. And with that, it becomes more about how do I get the most out of these tools that have consumed a third or 40% of the internet? And suddenly, how do I get out the ideas from that system? And a lot about it, the tricky thing with creativity in general is that if you have the blank page and you have all the different options, how do you define what you actually want to see? And it's very similar with a lot of the large language models right now, where it's about, do I want to replicate the tone of voice of the New York Times? Do I want to have something that sounds like Snoop Dogg? Do I want to have a McKinsey type convoluted sentence with a lot of very vague adjectives, right? The challenge right now, I think, is not the technology per se. It's about us interacting with technology in the right way and making sure that in my workflow and in my day-to-day, I'm actually using it the right way. Let me give, like you basically said it, right? Like in our generation, remote first, we oftentimes don't bounce off ideas. And that's actually one thing where AI can be incredibly helpful. So a lot of our creatives, they actually use it nearly as a rubber duck, right? Like nearly as another person sitting there, explaining different ideas, asking questions to the creative, rather than being the final truth. And I think that's something that is very unique nowadays with the technology that we actually have someone that has consumed a third of the internet and is able to generate new ideas with us together as we're explaining things.
So, Jan, you lead the consulting function at Superside, and your website lists that you've worked with 500 of the world's biggest brands. Can you help us understand what these brands are coming to you for? What are the challenges that they need your help with?
There's couple of different challenges, but they all kind of go back to the same part. A lot of companies under an incredible pressure to produce more creative assets with the same budget, with the same number of people. So ultimately, most of the companies, they're really asking for, how can I make more out of the people that I have? Now, naturally, that unfolds in different ways. So we've worked with some of the largest consultancy firms in the world and their creative teams on structuring, how do I roll that out across the hundreds of creatives? From where do I stand right now? Like, where is the mindset? How afraid are they of AI? How much are they already using it? What are the biggest use cases and where's the largest impact? Help them prioritize and then go to that upskilling, go to that tech enablement. So that's on the larger side of things, right? Like sometimes it's really that strategy, understanding where to focus on. And then from there, going to a very structured rollout, keeping in mind capacity, right? That's one side. The other side that we start seeing is even large brands often have very small, nimble creative teams. And they are oftentimes asked to double, 3x their output. And with them, we're oftentimes doing a two-pronged approach with yes, strategy, yes, upskilling. How do I use the best tools in my workflow? How do I re-engineer that workflow? And the second piece is, how do I generate workflow automation solutions that use AI? So one concrete example, we're working right now with one brand in their static digital asset creation process. They have tons of different brands that they're working with themselves. And with it, there's a big challenge because every single brand they work with, they want to have their digital assets in multiple different languages, in multiple different sizes, for multiple different segments. And suddenly, when you have AI and you combine it with automation, you're able to unlock 70, 80, 90% efficiency gains because suddenly we're taking away a lot of the manual, cumbersome labor and we help them automate that. So that's a bit the other piece that we see. Also, e-commerce is right. Like thinking about SKU imagery of products, it's a big use case that they come to us. So it's really about like, how do I sort out, how do I get my ducks in the row in terms of strategy? How do I bring along all my people? How do I upskill all of them? And then how do I use technology really as a lever to get to these efficiency gains?
So let's contextualize it. Imagine I'm Expedia and I have multiple brands. I have to localize around the world. I have to do multilingual. I have different products. I have different campaigns. What is it that GenAI can do to help me today?
There's a lot that it can do. And again, right, like if you think about through your creative production process, there's a lot that it can do in the localization, but not just translating, but transcreating. So what type of, let's say, copy resonates with a buying persona in Japan is probably very different to what resonates in Italy, what resonates in the US. And even within the US, right, it's a very big country with a lot of different types of personas that naturally resonate to different copy, to different visuals, right? So generative AI can help in that transcreation challenge. Like that's one piece. And naturally with it, that's just language, that's text. There's also a part where it's very helpful in terms of adjusting the visual assets to that. So naturally, if you think about the stock photography that most brands use, oftentimes it's very undiverse. It's very much focused on your Western Caucasian population. And it's very difficult to find sufficient diverse images. And that's one piece where, in case of Expedia, it can really help, it can really unlock. Where it's suddenly not anymore that I have the same type of people across all my geographies, across all my segments. But because I can replace stock photography, it gives me that extra bit in terms of specificity. So that's like the two components that go into your static ad. And now the third piece, which is a bit more boring, arguably, like people don't really like talking about it now because AI is like the new shiny thing. But the truth is there's a lot of value in automation because once you've done your deeper segmentation, you've created all your different copy, you created all your different variants of your visual assets, you still need to roll it out. And you need to bring that into your different assets of the different sizes for different channels. So that's the third piece, which is less AI shiny side of things. It's more towards like robotic process automation. But that's really where we see combining these three things, where there's a lot of value that an Expedia, for instance, can take out.
So a brand like that, let's imagine that you can 10x their creative production. What does that enable their strategic leadership and their design leadership to do, to unleash, to unlock? Is there something that will change in terms of how brands are built and deployed as a result of this?
There are a few main changes that are happening. I think one trend that we're seeing, even without AI, is the need to be much more targeted to much smaller segments. And that comes from the fact that with the internet and with more and more brands springing up, there is a very strong competition on eyeballs. Like everyone wants to get their content in front of the right buyer at the right time. And naturally, if I'm as a brand able to generate 10x content, I actually don't generate 10x content for each eyeball. Actually, what I'm doing is I'm segmenting my eyeballs smaller, making sure that what I'm sending out and what I'm showing to customer is right to his segment, let's say his geography, his age group, his interests. It is right in that buying journey. Is that a person that has looked for that product before or not? Right? Like, is it educational content? Is it more already converting content for that buyer? Right? And then also brands are starting to look into things such as changing their content based on the weather, based on the season and so on, right? And these are things where suddenly, if I'm able to 10x content, I can be much more specific, much more tailored to my different segments. And that's one thing that really enables, right? So being able to target my consumer much more specifically. I think that's one part that's changing. The other part that is changing is naturally to enable that. There's a different approach to your brand, to your design system, where it becomes more about what are the central components that I need to control? Like, what's my tone of voice? How does my tone of voice change when I go to different segments? What is my visual direction? What's my visual style, right? And with that, we're starting to see brands that start building that on AI, where it's suddenly like, I have my large language model that is trained on my tone of voice in my different languages. I have visual styles that are cohesive no matter which segments I roll out. And the good thing about that is because I'm using more technology, it forces us to standardize the creativity or the creative assets that we're producing, with brand leaders being able to enforce that this is their tone of voice, because suddenly it's enforced by technology to some extent. So those are like two main changes. It's like one is hyper-personalization. Even though the term has been overused, it's still very valid and very useful. In the other part, defining a brand more in terms of technology rather than just your next 100 PDF that outlines your brand guidelines.
What you're putting forward is really interesting because if we go back 50 years to the traditional agency workflow, they were there to create a brand voice for your organization. That brand transmitted a message about itself. It wasn't a conversation, but what you're putting forward here is that these generative tools enable brands based off of data-focused generative capabilities to have conversations at micro instances. And that really changes the entire perspective of what a designer needs to do, what a researcher needs to do, and what a product needs to do. We need to shift our entire mindset to become hyper generative and hyper focused. Is this something we're ready for today? Because that sounds like a big shift, particularly since agencies still are in control of a lot of the budgets for these creative teams.
I think we're not 100% ready, to be honest. I think there's still a lot of old mindset where it's the human that needs to do every single step. And also arguably, not to step on anyone's toes, I think digitalization and system thinking is not as prevalent in a creative organization, nor in a marketing organization, arguably. Even tracking the performance of creative work and bringing that feedback cycle from your marketing team back to your creative team, that's oftentimes not happening. We spoke to many enterprises, and that's one thing that we've consistently seen is that feedback cycle isn't even closed. And that's just all technology. That's just saying I close the feedback loop from my click-through rates, from my conversion rates, all the way to the creator. So that's one thing that is not happening in terms of enablement. But then also, if you think about all what I described in terms of hyper-personalization, we start seeing that in very few instances. There are these campaigns such as, I forgot which brand it was, that sent out basically videos of a very famous person, of an actor in Southeast Asia. I think that was the geography they did it, with like AI generated voice talking directly to the person that now signed up for the newsletter. And I think that's a very cool activation. I think it's very unique. It shows that ingenuity and so on. The problem is that it requires a very different skill set suddenly. Like, this is not anymore done by a regular creative. This is a combination of creativity, i.e., what do we want to talk about? What's the visual direction? What's the unique idea? And then combine that with AI engineering, with software engineering, and really creating these automated workflows to generate that. And I think that's the struggle that most creatives find themselves in, or most creative departments find themselves in right now, is that they don't have necessarily the right talent to enable these tech-first workflows, but they're still more in the manual, handcrafted creative, which is getting more and more disruptive, right? And I think that's the reason why we are not seeing at large these hyper-personalized campaigns, is really the fact that it's oftentimes not the right talent in the creative teams. And there's sometimes a lack of understanding of what's possible if you combine technology with the data that you're having in your marketing team, with all different segments, with the creative assets that you can generate. So I think there's a lot about closing that loop by including multidisciplinary teams that have the right capabilities across all of these segments.
We've just started talking about some of the barriers. What are some of the other, considerations, limitations, whatever it might be, that would limit a team's ability or organization or brand's ability to leverage AI properly? Would it be something about vision, planning, processes? What is it that might be limiting organizations?
Short and undifferentiated answer is all of the above. It's across your vision. Where do I think as a leader that AI will transform my creative organization? And arguably, this is a big ask for leaders that often come from a creative background and not from a technology background, that suddenly need to upskill themselves on a very new technology that is evolving on a week-by-week basis. And with that, it's in addition to their current workload, which is oftentimes in creative agencies very high. Like, most creative agencies won't complain about having 2 short days. I think the problem is that it's a very new skill set, a very different thinking that suddenly is put on a creative leader. I think that's one part, right? Like, what is it that I can achieve and where should I focus on? I think that's one challenge. I think the other challenge that I talked about a bit is like legal, where many enterprises are stifling themselves because naturally a legal department's purpose is to protect the company. And given the field is moving so fast, there's a lot of uncertainty. That's one barrier where it takes a lot of effort to go through that procurement, through that legal, to be able to actually use these use cases. And I think there's a shift happening right now because the market as a whole is moving. Leaders understand more the ROI of it. And also there are more precedences of people using that technology. So it becomes easier, but that's still something where a lot of leaders are afraid of using AI, partly because of legal, partly because of reputation. Because if you think back, the AI campaign from Coca-Cola, which caused a lot of outrage last year as well, it is something that leaders are naturally a bit careful. So that's both of these. I'm talking more to your VP of brand, VP of design, CMO type person. There's a very real other problem. And that's what we called in one of our blog posts, actually, the identity crisis of the creative, where it's really going into your organization and realizing that the fact is that most of your creatives are not technologists. Like, they didn't go into becoming an illustrator, becoming a photographer, a videographer, because they wanted to use technology. They came in because they want to express themselves and express their creativity. And there's a huge shift in terms of mindset when we're starting to work with AI. And oftentimes, to be fair, it's not necessarily the best creators that adopt the technology first. Oftentimes, it's the people that have the biggest gaps in some areas. Let's say the people that were not as good in illustrating, that suddenly see like AI complements their skills, that adopt it first. Because there's a natural learning curve. And in the beginning, if you use AI, it is difficult. And sometimes it's not producing the right outcome. It's not really on brand and so on. And getting an organization through that learning curve over that initial hump is actually very challenging. So I think it's really these three things. It's like the vision, where can I go to? Do I want to use AI as an organization despite some of the legal uncertainties, despite some of the reputational risks that I'm taking? And then last but not least, how do I bring along an organization that is not necessarily AI first, that has seen their industry disrupted massively, which is something that is challenging, right? And I think within these three, going through them in a structured manner is typically required in order to go to that full adoption. And because of that, because it's such a multifaceted challenge, I think that's one of the reasons why we're only now seeing that adoption happening, because people realize that it's not just the upskilling. It's not just buying a new tool, but it's actually something that touches many parts of my organization and of my enterprise at the end.
Now, a theme that a lot of guests have discussed with us has been, what is the right organizational design? So I'm wondering from your clients, the ones that successfully implement this, there's been ideas that, a top-down vision-based one works better. There's been thoughts that a bottom-up experimental approach is better. There's been thoughts that a centralized creative authority is better. There's been thoughts that a very decentralized one, again, encourages experimentation. What organizational designs or corporate strategies have you seen effective in terms of leveraging this technology in it?
I think it depends slightly on the scale and what type of organization it is. So if you're a small organization, let's say you're a team of 5, you're a team of 10 creators in an organization, then it's really about how do you foster innovation within that small team. So how do you allow experimentation with new tools? How do you give people time for that? And how do you then share knowledge across the team, right? And sometimes you designate one person to be your AI forward champion, and that champion gets enabled to spend half a day a week on exploring new tools and exploring new things. And you have these sharing sessions as a team, and like, hey, I found this thing that worked really nice, right? And you create that culture of innovation within the team. And I think that's a topic that's across all sizes, right? Like, culture of innovation is something that we see being the differentiator between a leading organization in AI and a laggard. It's about, are my people curious? Are they interested in new technology? And am I allowing them to play around with new things? Or on the opposite side of the spectrum, do I have an organization that is very based on rules, based on limitations, based on you have to ask first before you try something? And oftentimes we see organizations that are very passive in terms of waiting for the change happening to them. So I think that's in a small, but it's really just about, how do I make innovation happening, make an innovation culture, enable a few people to do that exploration on their own time. When we talk about large organizations, like 200, 250 creatives or more, we end up at a place where you have to distinguish between established workflows that just needs to get executed, right? Like large consulting firms that just need to get slide decks prepared, or large, let's say, fashion companies, e-commerces that just need to get their SKU images produced faster. And there is a bit of that nuance of you probably can't allow your whole organization to spend their work time innovating. Because with that, naturally, you're reducing your capacity and you become inefficient. For these organizations, oftentimes the better model is to, yes, allow some innovation across the board and creating an innovation culture and so on, while having a dedicated team that is responsible for each of the use cases to define what is the new best thing that I should be doing. How do I, for instance, in our case, right, like a Superside, we have a central team for that standardize workflows. Like we have more than 40 workflows standardized how to use AI for them, right? And with that, we create an innovation culture. So our creators are curious. They want to see what's new. We have like an AI channel where every day there's new news of things that are happening, right? But at the same time, we take that structured approach as well, where it's about what is now the right thing for that specific workflow and bring that back in terms of training to an organization. Because the truth is any change is difficult and it gets even more difficult the larger you get. And with it, you can't change everyone's day-to-day work on a weekly basis. But you can have a small group that's changing their work on a day-to-day basis because they are the ones, the innovators, they are the ones that are like figuring out the new tools. And then once they find things that are stable, things that really bring value, that are proven, you bring them back to the wider organization. So it really depends. Like if you're small, probably you just create an innovation culture. If you're large, you probably want to have some kind of dedicated team that helps you sort out the workflows and then bring that back to your wider organization.
We've been talking a lot about teams who are already implementing AI. I'd like to do a thought experiment here where I'm a product leader in an organization, and I know that in 2026, there's budget earmarked to go out and work with an external vendor. What can I, as a product leader, do to prep for that? Are there certain, you discussed workflow mapping. Are there certain processes or steps that you think would help a team prepare itself to grow at scale with this technology?
The interesting thing about generative AI as it is right now is that nearly no matter what the workflow is and what the specific application is, there's typically a use case for rolling out AI. So if you think about it, right, like we've seen everything from customer success being disrupted to legal teams being disrupted using a lot of AI tools now for reviewing legal documents, to Goldman Sachs now doing a lot of their IPO documents, at least 95% automatically using AI, right? Like just naming a couple of examples to show that AI is not anymore a very specific nail for one problem, but it's actually very broadly applicable. There's a good side and a bad side to that. The good side is we can achieve a lot of value. The bad side is it's very difficult to figure out where to start from and what to prioritize, because you don't want to start from a workflow that one person does once a month. You want to start from something that's actually relevant and actually moves the needle for your teams. So the one prerequisite to, especially at a larger enterprise scale, to make the rollout successful is, and this sounds very cliche, is to have the right data. To have data on what are my people specifically working on every single day. And what are the things that take the most time? And from there, it suddenly becomes easier to map out, let's say that workflow actually takes 30 people per year to being executed. And that's the one that's growing the fastest, right? And suddenly it becomes easier to say like, hey, these are probably the use cases we want to tackle first, that we want to look into. Is there impact with AI? And most of the times the answer is yes. The question is just how much. And then from there, from that data, that understanding of my organization, then go in and roll it out. That's one piece that leaders can do. Mapping out what are they doing on a day-to-day basis. The other part where we see companies being much better prepared nowadays is when you already start communicating on AI the right way with your teams. So even though you might not yet be at the stage where you have a full-on rollout, there's a lot of things that you can do in terms of helping them slowly adapt to it. That could be Maybe you want to have an external vendor that gives you a quick talk on like, hey, these are cool ideas of how AI helps, right? It could be we're giving everyone a license to a tool already. Let's say, hey, you all get ChatGPT licenses. And by the way, here are 2 cool use cases that you can do. And you do something. At least you do something. And the reason you want to do that is not because you see a lot of immediate efficiency. What we found is that just by having licenses and just by playing around, without telling them how exactly to apply it in their workflow, the 80-90% of the organization are not going to see efficiency gains. But what it does is it plants the seed for AI is here and AI is here to stay. And it's not something to be afraid of. So for instance, now we're working with one client and they did exactly that. They procured a couple of different licenses. They had their teams play around with it a little bit. And now we're working with them. And the good thing that we've seen, even though they're still early in the adoption of AI, like in terms of regular usage, it's still fairly low, but there's a much smaller fear towards AI and there's a much bigger excitement about the potential. And I think that's something where it's really about that innovation culture again, setting that up early, talking about it, making it part of your agenda in your town halls, in your weekly team meetings and so on. It suddenly sets you up once you get to that place where you want to have that rollout, that it's not a new message. It's something that people already started feeling comfortable with.
Now, again, we always have to go back to some of the fears because those fears persist in these teams. I'd like to understand for a client that might care about having higher quality outputs or more creative outputs or using more ethical models, are there ways for them to better align to those values in the way it's implemented? Are options available so that they can squash some of the fears that might exist in their teams?
No, 100%. 100%. I think there are a couple of themes you mentioned, right? Like quality of output, one of them. The truth is that oftentimes what people have seen is either outdated. It might be an old model that was there a year ago, or it's not the high quality output that you can get out. And that oftentimes happens because people play around with tools because they are seemingly easy, because it's a human chat interface, right? So it's simple to write something. The truth is it's simple to write something. It's very difficult to write something that is on brand, following the creative direction. And because of that, we've seen a lot of creatives that have opened a tool or seen something. They tried it once and they get frustrated because they feel like, hey, this is not delivering any value to me and I could have done that better in my traditional work. And that frustration oftentimes creates that resistance towards applying AI because it feels like, well, the first time I prompted ChatGPT, it didn't give me the right copy. Or the first time I used Midjourney, it wasn't the right output. But the truth is, it's seemingly easy to use, but in fact, it's actually hard and it's a hard skill to learn. And people haven't really accepted that fact yet. So that's just on quality of output. The other piece that you mentioned, ethical considerations. There are some things that organizations do on that one specifically, right? And it oftentimes goes down to like, what type of tools do I use that were trained on what type of data? So one thing that we as a company do is, right, like we are somewhat model agnostic. And naturally with that, we have the choice. Do we want to use a Midjourney that was trained on a lot of images, probably without licenses, and is following that legal narrative of fair usage rather than of attribution and compensation? And some clients are very happy with that and they're fine because it is a legal gray zone right now. Other clients are not. And for them, we actually go a different route. We say like, hey, either we can use Adobe Firefly, where at least in their words, the data that they use, they have licenses for. Interestingly, you can find a bit of like Midjourney images that were probably in that training set. Let's leave that aside, right? But at least in their statement, they're claiming that it is only licensed data. There's another company called Priya AI, and they go one step further, where they actually attribute each image generated to the data that influenced that image, and then are compensating on the backside of it the creators of that image. And that's a decision where, depending on where your organization stands on the ethics of it, just the knowledge that that's available and the knowledge that like I can go down a route where artists are compensated for their work if it's impacting the model output is something that becomes very attractive to people because it alleviates a bit the fears there. So that's a bit like in terms of quality of output and ethical considerations that can help. The third question or the third fear that we typically see is just job security, naturally, and I think rightfully so. We've seen so many news on especially customer success being reduced due to AI, sales organizations being reduced due to AI, sometimes also software engineers, right? Given that you can see 30, 40% more efficient software engineering nowadays, it's rightful that there's a fear. The truth is though, like what we talked about earlier, the uniqueness of creativity protects you to some extent from these job losses because your unique idea, unique creativity is still needed in an age of AI. And oftentimes, honestly, with creative agencies, the issue is more that they have to do more work rather than you want to keep work stable and reduce cost. And that's one facet. The other facet in there is that we've surveyed roughly 1,000 employees, creatives. And one thing that we've consistently seen is that the fear of job loss goes down as people start adopting and regularly using AI. And that's something that on the first side, it seems surprising because you would assume as they start to get to know the tools and they see how powerful they are, they get less afraid. But the truth is what I said, because I'm a creative and my creative idea is what matters most. I'm suddenly starting to see that AI is a force multiplier for my creativity. And with that, it's not here to replace me. It's here to enable me and make my work better. Similar, Photoshop, when it came out, was making people create better things rather than just replace them.
Well, Jan, thank you so much for your time. Before you go, though, where can people go to keep up with your advice, your lessons, or speak to you?
For sure. So we have a blog on superside.com where we talk about the latest of AI. Also, feel free to reach out to me directly, either through our website, through LinkedIn. Always happy to chat, always happy to talk to these conversations. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing where the future goes in next year because it sounds like it's going to be an upward innovation curve.
100%. Very interesting times ahead.
Thank you for listening to the Design of AI podcast. We provide a pragmatic and practical deep dive into what AI can do and how it's transforming industries. We help designers, researchers, and product managers excel in a rapidly changing future. If you find this strategic content helpful, make sure to follow us on your favorite podcasting app. It really helps us if you leave reviews. This episode was hosted by Arpi Drag-Picarero, the founder and head of product strategy for PH1 Research, and Brittany Hobbs, VP Insights at Huge. Please make sure to subscribe to our Substack to never miss an episode. On the Design of AI Substack, you'll also receive more strategic insights and recommended products. We'll also be announcing events soon too at designofai.substack.com.